Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Welsh Republic podcast, episode 64. And I am here with my guest, Flynn Jameson. How are you doing today, Flynn?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
It's an honor to have you, mate. What have you been up to today? Anything much?
Just kind of I tend to follow the markets, so I was watching, the latest financial news. I've been following a lot of what the banking companies have been up to because obviously there's a whole lot going on with interest rates and inflation, and obviously the British pound, which is collapsing as we speak. So there's been a whole lot of action going on that I just kind of follow along different storylines to see, what's most important really at the end of the day.
Yeah, same thing, dude. I also saw that too. I also saw that Britain has cancelled their mortgages, which is very, very scary, apparently.
Yeah, well, like it's interesting because for the longest time, especially the US, Canada, Australia, the UK, and even New Zealand too, have all had simultaneous housing bubbles for decades. And I know that it's a lot more intense in the UK because income levels are a lot lower than out here in the US or in Australia. But whenever you hear that banks are essentially halting new mortgages, that is not a good sign.
Nope, it's not because it's all a part of the New World Order agenda, to get rid of the financial freedom, to get rid of cash and bring us into, a cashless society.
Yeah, well, and even bigger than that, it's essentially removing power from the individual to be able to control their personal lives. Because, on one hand, we're coming from an old world system where there's an employer employee relationship, which has been very much kept in a traditional perspective where the employer always has more power than the employee. And we've shifted to a lot more, self employment, entrepreneurship, and a lot of small business, of course. And so what's been happening with the whole mortgage situation is scary because if people don't own their own home, then there goes the vast majority of people's wealth. Because especially in Australia and Canada, and not as much in the U.S., but still pretty big. Uh, Home equity is a huge part of people's net worth, and that whole wealth effect, where if you look at your tax assessment for the year and you see that your home value has gone up $100,000, you feel as though you're $100,000 wealthier. Whereas if you're stuck in renting for an indefinite amount of time, you don't own home equity, you don't control your home environment, and you're pretty much held at the mercy of whatever corporate landlord you are renting from. And they can jack up your rent however much they want. There's no law that protects you from, exploitative rent increases. And at the end of the day, for as long as people are renting, they are never going to be able to truly take control of their lives because they don't own anything. As they say, you will own nothing and be happy. And that doesn't actually work.
Exactly. And I also think, especially when they're trying to put everybody on rent, that's the thing. How would you fix the housing market crisis, Flynn?
What country or region specific? Because I know like a lot of them have similarities, but there are some.
Like in America and in
So
Europe and in Australia and New Zealand.
So first and foremost, I would eliminate adjustable rate mortgages entirely because they are used to entrap people who think that, oh, I'm signing a 5 year mortgage and I'm paying, 3% interest. But what they don't tell you is after those 3 or 4 or 5 years are up, they can change your interest rate to whatever they really want. And so these adjustable rate mortgages are the vast majority of the mortgages in Canada and Australia. And I'm not as sure about the UK, but because the housing bubbles in Canada and Australia are so big, and because there's such a massive concentration of wealth in the home equity, the fact that most people, especially young people, are in these adjustable rate mortgages, when interest rates start going up a lot, they're going to get wiped out because I don't know about you, but I don't know many people who can afford, a 7% interest rate on a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. Like that's incredible. And this is only the beginning. Like we're seeing, the 30-year fixed rate in the US past 7% today. And my forecast is we're going to see 10% on the 30-year before the bottom falls out because people are already struggling to make ends meet. And especially in the United States, the general rule of thumb has always been you don't want to spend more than 30% or 33% of your monthly income on housing. But it turns out most people are spending more than 50% of their monthly income on housing expenses. And that's
And
before you even,
food and taxes, and
yeah,
it's just like it's
and
outrageous, isn't it?
and especially with the UK, your power bills, which are absolutely insane. I mean, I thought
And you
elect
see people in Italy and in England
yeah,
burning the power bills. That's how bad they're
yes.
getting. And
Well,
Germany right now, they're protesting it. There's a mass protest going on everywhere in Western Europe.
yeah, well, and like today there were reports coming out both from the Swedish economic zone and the Danish economic zone that the Nord Stream 1 pipeline is pretty much shut down until further notice because there are massive leaks
Yeah,
in the
I
pipeline, and
did see that. And
all that's going
guess
to
who did it?
do.
It's obvious the United States government did that. It's obvious the United States government did that because that's all a part of the Great Reset agenda. And what they'll do, they'll blame it on Russia, but it's actually the United States and the bankers who are doing that.
Well, and I've thought about this for a long time because a few years back, I was really interested in investing in Russian stocks because I understood that the Russian economy was growing, regardless of what the Western media said. And unlike the West, Russia is self sufficient economically. So Russia
Hmm.
does not have to depend on other countries to survive, which is incredible because whenever the entire, NATO alliance sanctions you, their expectation is that they will make you scream for help. When in fact, Russia increased its grain production, they increased their oil production, they increased their gold production. It's like everything that NATO tried to do failed. And Russia's going to have the last laugh because at the end of the day, people need fuel to heat their homes. And there was just a report out of Germany that firewood prices are exploding and going parabolic because everybody is rushing to buy firewood because there's no fuel. And you can thank the German government for shutting down all their nuclear plants because on one hand you have these green people. Let's just leave it at that. The Greens, who are basically anti petroleum fuel, which is the most abundant natural resource we have on Earth next to water. And when you cut off the major supply of fuel, you're going to create a supply shock. And we're starting to see that play out in places like Italy and the UK, where you mentioned, but also, I mean, we see the same thing in the Netherlands, where the government is trying to tell farmers that they can't use fertilizer because fertilizer, leads to greenhouse gas emissions or whatever they're claiming. And it's like, do you realize that if you interfere with the food supply, you're hurting everyone? You're not just hurting Dutch farmers, you're hurting
Yeah.
all of the people who the Dutch farmers supply the food to. So you're going to lead to higher food prices, which everyone already knows about. And of course, in general, when people can't make as much money selling their food on the open market, well, they tend to need to do something else. And it's essentially leading to discouraging people from entering the agricultural sector. Because if you can't start a farm as a small business to produce enough food for your local community, you're not going to do that because it's really capital intensive. You have to buy machinery and equipment, you have to buy insurance, and at the end of the day, most people just don't have any money left. And we're going to see the same thing happen in Spain and in Portugal because
Oh,
they are
Spain and
also,
Portugal are
yeah,
fucked. Spain and
yeah,
Portugal are
oh yeah,
fucked. They they've been fucked pretty much since like 2010 and 2014 because I remember they had to have a lot of bailouts and the global financial crisis ruined them. And Greece is just
I don't know if you follow. There's the I think it's called the U.S. Government Debt Clock.com, the website where it shows all the
yeah,
national
I've
debt. So
seen it. It is
yeah,
pretty insane.
so the funny thing about that is typically whenever a country's central bank's national debt to GDP ratio exceeds 130%, that means they are insolvent. And if you look at countries like Japan and Greece and Argentina, and of course Portugal and soon Spain and France and Italy are right there. The UK's pushing all those countries. Yeah, and
Netherlands, Switzerland, also let's not forget Canada
so
too.
but the thing about Switzerland though is that they are the center of finance in Europe. So I don't honestly believe that the
Yeah,
Swiss
that's
banks
true.
are going to let this happen, because if they do, that's the end of their power, because they exert their control through financial matters. So whenever you have, for example, a war to finance, who do you go to get your financing? You go to the Swiss because they're a neutral
Mhm.
country, supposedly. So even though, they are technically the center of finance in Europe, you have entities like the European Central Bank, which has been printing money nonstop for, 14 years. You have the Bank of
And the
England.
Greater Bank of England, the Greater
Yeah,
Bank
well,
of sorry, the Greater City of London, which is the economic, capital of the
yeah.
world, where they control the world economically.
Well, and like with London, I remember a long time ago, I think it was probably 2004, 2005, the Bank of England sold off most of its gold reserves. So they don't have a hedge. When the British pound ultimately goes to zero, the Bank of England is going to have to choose another currency because they don't have silver and they don't have gold. And they can steal as much of Venezuela's gold as they want. It will not make a difference when the British pound goes down, because there isn't enough gold in the world to backstop the British pound, just like there isn't enough gold in the world to backstop the US dollar, because it's just printed into infinity with no accountability. And when it comes time, with this whole quantitative tightening, there really isn't a mechanism in place that can technically shrink the money supply, because that would involve actually removing liquidity from the system. And the last time they tried doing that, they collapsed the global economy. And if they do that, the same thing will happen again, except this time there's so much more debt. Interest rates are going up catastrophically across the world, and you have countries like Russia who are sitting there with the best performing fiat currency in the world for 2022 that's essentially backed by gold.
Yep, that's why one of the reasons why they're doing well. And going forward, that's one of the reasons why Russia and Brazil and also India. Well, if you could
Yeah,
argue with India, are going to be the world maybe superpowers going forward because
for
the
sure.
West is done, and also Russia's got a lot of resources. They've got like gas, they've got this, which is really helpful towards them. Who,
Yeah.
Flynn, who do you think, when, like, let's say in 2025, going forward in the next 10 years, what countries do you think are going to be the next, as economist yourself,
Yeah.
what countries are going to be the next economic superpower? So, for example, like, especially with BRICS, like, there are some people saying Brazil's going to be the world superpower, especially with all their resources. There are some people saying Africa has a lot of potential. There are some, and especially what people are saying about Russia and India. What is your thoughts on that? And who do you think will be the next economic superpowers going forward in the next 10 years?
So typically, what I look for is, obviously how self sufficient is a country. So obviously, Russia's up there. But also, who controls the resources that are going to be in high demand going forward. So obviously, there's been this humongous push for electric vehicles and the batteries that go in them. Well, lithium and cobalt are in extremely high demand. They're in extreme deficit because there's not enough of it currently circulating to meet the demand, from companies like Tesla or Volkswagen. So Brazil definitely has the opportunity to do that. The problem with Brazil is that there's just too much corruption in their government. If you look at their banking system, they have some of the highest interest rates in the Western world. So the Brazilian banks are doing just fine, but the Brazilian people have been in a de facto recession for close to a year now. And I was an investor in Brazilian companies going back to 2018. And I remember reading about how, Brazil has a growing middle class. The biggest portion of their economy is small and medium businesses, the backbone of what builds a strong economy. But because their financial system is pretty much stuck in the 20th century, they are going to encounter serious problems financially because there's a lot of poor people in Brazil, and those people need purchasing power. And as you know, all fiat currencies eventually go to zero. The Brazilian real is no different, although it has been relatively stable compared to a lot of other currencies. I think that the biggest factor for Brazil will be how efficiently can they extract their natural resources and sell them on the open market. And going off of Brazil, I would say another one just based solely off of resources would be Australia, because Australia has gold, which everyone wants. They have iron ore, which China needs. And of course, the United States is another client of Australia. So it's not as if the U.S. economy is just going to roll over and collapse into nothingness. I mean, they're going to U.S. companies are going to keep buying iron ore because they need to make steel, and steel is a huge export. But yeah, kind of going off the resources idea, I think that Russia is a big player for sure, not just in the traditional resources space, but also with food production. I mean, who's going to sell the world food? These
Are
past three
you,
years,
Flynn,
yeah.
before we continue talking, are you an expert in military stuff or no?
I know a little, but that's not really been my focus. Like I know kind of more so just Western. I'm not really all that well versed in the
We
military
can get, but
new stuff.
we can get back to the military thing. So, like you're
Yeah.
saying, you say that Russia's pretty much going to be the world's superpower, maybe, well,
Well,
economic
the
superpower at the end of the decade. Go
the
ahead.
biggest problem right now is that because most of the NATO alliance is sanctioning Russia, Russia has had to basically create a parallel world payments system. It's called MIR. And
Mhm.
there was just a report that came out. Turkey kowtowed to NATO pressure, and Turkey has dropped the MIR payment system. Turkey's a big agricultural producer, and they trade a lot with Russia. So I think what NATO's trying to do is cut off all of Russia's trading partners. Luckily, Russia will still have China. They will still have Japan. They'll still have Kazakhstan. Of course, they still have Germany. Germany is not going to cut all trade ties with Russia. No matter what the media might say, German corporations need fuel. So Russia definitely has a role to play because they grow so much food, they export so much food, they have so much oil, so much gas. And going forward, it doesn't really look like any country in Europe really has much ground to stand on because, like, for example, in the UK has been deindustrializing since the 1970s.
Yeah,
Ireland has,
from like the mining crisis of
yes,
1980,
yeah.
which really fucked it up.
Well, and like, and
You
then you,
go ahead.
yeah, and then you have Ireland, which has been essentially hollowed out as a corporate tax haven. So there's really no jobs in both the UK and Ireland for young people. So eventually, at some point, there is going to be a version of a revolution, regardless of whether it's in the streets or not, because people need to work. And Ireland has been absolutely abused by the British for centuries.
Oh yeah, the
And
royal family treats
and
Ireland like shit. Like Flynn, when you talk about that as a Welsh person,
mhm,
especially when you look at like what Russia's doing, like with the European Union and how Russia's pretty much smashing them and like the
yeah.
energy war, and Russia's like pretty much just overwhelming them with that and running circles around them. I
Mhm.
think when the European Union collapses, maybe like in 2025, if it does, I think what will happen is a lot of British people, like countries like Wales and Scotland, will want to be more independent. As soon as the pound goes to shit, Wales and Scotland will also want to become independent. Northern Ireland will want to become independent. And I also think, especially in the United States, where the dollar is going to become worthless, this is where I think you're going to have more resistance, like in Texas and Florida and New Hampshire, to become their own independent states and for them to go on the gold standard. You see what I mean by that?
Yeah, so the one issue with the Texas narrative is that when Texas joined the Union following the so-called Civil War, Texas gave up all rights to secession. So if they were to do such a thing, it would be a rebellion against the U.S. government in D.C., and that would be pretty catastrophic because Texas, behind California, Texas is the economic engine of the United States. If Texas leaves that union, that is that is 26 million people. That is billions upon billions of dollars in oil money, which, by the way, is what the U.S. economy is addicted to. So, even like, for example, with Florida, Florida doesn't necessarily produce a wide variety of products. They do grow a lot of food, which is important, obviously. But at the end of the day, Florida has such high taxes when it comes to utilities and when it comes to, of course, rent. Like, I just saw a report that said Miami's average rents are approaching like $4,000 a month, which is insane because only the top 1% can afford to live there at that point. And all of your, like, at some point, there has to be an adjustment in the rents in places like Texas and Florida because your labor force has to live somewhere. You can't just have an economy without a labor force. As the UK has found out, they've been importing immigrants for decades, in fact, for generations, because there's no workforce really left. Like you don't have a mining sector to speak of. You've hollowed out the financial sector. You don't have food production really. Like there's a whole lot of dependence on imports. And like with the United States, I've driven across most of the Western US and it's pretty empty. It's just a fact. It's empty. There aren't that many people living in the interior of the country. It is heavily concentrated, California, Oregon, Washington, the West Coast, the East Coast, Texas, and then like the old Rust Belt area around Michigan, Pennsylvania, that space. Other than that, most of the country is pretty barren. And the land itself isn't particularly arable. You can't grow things in a lot of the country. So you wind up heavily concentrating the food supply and the food supply chains, as we found out, in very specific regions of the country. So even if, for example, you take Texas, which has a gigantic agricultural industry, you've got cattle, you've got cotton, and you've got corn and grains because it's all heavily subsidized by taxpayer money. So if you removed all federal subsidies for corn, farmers would stop growing corn because it isn't profitable to grow corn. It's highly water intensive, and there are water shortages going on right now. Whereas compare the United States to Russia, there is no water shortage to speak of. They have melting permafrost, which will only increase the amount of water they have to use and the amount of land they get to grow things on. And unlike the United States, which is very fragmented, not just politically but socially as well, Russia is a whole lot more cohesive as a country. So even if there is internal opposition to Putin, there is still a whole lot of support for him because
Oh
of
yeah,
how
80%. He has got a lot of
yeah.
support. I mean,
See, and it's because Russia as a country, or shall we say the Russian Federation, has to
mhm.
have a strong central government in order to exist. Otherwise, it would splinter into a million different republics, and it would be chaos. And that's what
Yeah.
NATO's trying to do right now. They succeeded in splitting up the Soviet Union in 1991. They broke apart the Ukraine. They took away Belarus. They took Kazakhstan, all the super mineral rich areas that were outside of
Mhm.
the country of Russia. They separated them. And so, really, what it comes down to is Russia is just a whole lot more cohesive and united than the United States has been in my lifetime. And
Exactly. And I mean, and also Russia, a lot of people say it's a dictatorship. Well, whether you agree with that or not, I mean, some people have different views, but Russia is a democracy. It is a constitutional republic. Like
yeah,
I did an interview with this guy from Ron. It has freedom of speech. It has freedom, of dignity. Like, dude, Edward Snowden just got, a grant
yes.
ship. Get over
And
that.
and by the
You're allowed
way,
to say how you feel in
the
Russia. You're allowed to say, you're allowed to
yeah.
protest. Well, depending on how you look at. So yeah, you get what I mean by that.
Yeah, well, and also think about this: is anyone asking why Edward Snowden went to Russia of all places? Does anyone want to
Oh, because
ask
he knew
that
it was a good
question?
place, dude. He knew it was a good place. It had freedom of speech. He knew that,
Well, and the
mhm.
bigger thing is essentially any country that is smaller than the United States is subject to U.S. imperialism and extradition treaties. Russia has
Yeah.
no such extradition agreement with the United States. And so you have a situation where people believe that in the United States you have free speech. You do not. They believe you have freedom to assembly. You do not. They believe you have freedom to petition your government, which technically you do. However, the government can then turn around and say, well, we do not believe that this ballot initiative that you got 200,000 signatures for is valid, and therefore we're not going to allow it. And it basically puts the onus on the people of a particular state or region to hire a legal team to then sue the government to try and force them to allow that ballot initiative onto, what would it be, 2022 November ballots. And you take Russia, for example. You have the Duma. It's a single unitary legislature. You don't have this ridiculous, so-called bipartisan divide
Nope.
like the
You
US
don't have
has.
any of those bankers controlling the
And
Kremlin or like
well, and like
controlling, their
the
Congress.
the bigger power in Russia though is the Orthodox Church. They're the real power brokers who really
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
decide social policy. And that's why a lot of people love to criticize Russia for having, these anti-gay laws or whatever you want to criticize, but it's like think about who actually runs Russia. Do you genuinely believe that Putin has absolute power because he has to
No,
answer
he
to his
doesn't.
constituents?
He
It's not
doesn't.
as if he like for example, in the United States, the president of the United States can write an executive order and then it's suddenly federal law. In Russia, if you tried to do that, you would have riots because they would demand a legislative session or hearing to debate whether or not this, order is actually valid constitutionally.
And
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 it's insane.
Flynn, also you have a lot of Muslims who live in Muslim. The Muslim population is the second most biggest population in Russia. You've got
Yeah.
Jews, you've got Christians who
Yes.
live amongst each other. I would love to go to that place. What's it start? It starts with T in Russia. What's it called
Tar-
again?
uh Tartarstan? No.
Yeah, I love to go to that place. It looks so beautiful, mate. Really
There
beautiful. But
it's
yeah, Flynn,
yeah.
very good points you bring up. I totally agree. Russia going forward is going to be a big superpower. Is going to be a big player. Probably, maybe will be the world's economic superpower in 10 years, but depending on how it is, going forward.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
Flynn,
yeah.
tell me about. Speaking of that, tell me about yourself. How did you get into economics when you were younger, and like, what book did
Yeah.
you read that led you into the path of economics? What's your
So,
journey towards, doing your podcast?
yeah.
And
Yeah, of
go ahead.
course. So,
Mhm.
I would say it was probably around 2003, so dating back to the latest invasion of Iraq. Um, my family began getting a regular subscription to the Wall Street Journal. So, I grew up actually reading the Wall Street Journal every single morning of my life. And with that, of course, you have your world news, your economic news, your business news, all sorts of stuff. And regardless of who runs the Wall Street Journal, Rupert Murdoch, it is the official business newspaper for Wall Street. So when it comes to getting a nice kind of selection, variety of information, it was a decent source for that. You could read an article one day about the United States, the next day about Latin America, following about Australia, Russia, China, Europe, and occasionally you'd even get stuff about the Middle East and Africa. And from a very young age, I've always been very interested in history. That was always my biggest passion. So I basically absorb information like a sponge. And really, anything that I could learn, I would seek out more information about. And so, in terms of the economic focus, kind of around 2003, I started focusing on just the major U.S. stock markets. So you had your Dow Jones Industrial Average, S&P 500, NASDAQ, and then the Russell 2000. And I kind of followed them loosely. There wasn't really like a particular company that I focused on, but I was more so just interested in how the financial markets worked, because whenever you see a big number, it kind of impresses you as a small child. But then you have to read into what does that number actually mean. For example, let's take Amazon, which at one point, was the most valuable company in the world for a short period of time. And before they did their most recent stock split, their shares were trading at close to $3,600 a piece. Well, if you actually look at how the company is set up from a financial perspective, you realize that there were over 640 million shares of the company. So the more stock splits that they would undergo, the bigger the company got. Regardless of whether the company was actually producing profit or not, that was irrelevant. So the way that the financial system was kind of set up, it it presents only one side of the story, which is most people only see the stock price. They don't ask, well, what's the actual financial health of the company? So like with the Wall Street Journal, the business section, they would include information like share counts, you know, um, your trade volume, 52-week highs and lows. It kind of gives you a feel of like what was going on. And even back in 2003, Amazon wasn't making profit. They were just growing like crazy. And so over the years, especially up until about 2011, which is when I stopped reading the Wall Street Journal regularly because I went off to college, um, I kind of got an idea of how the US markets worked. And going to college, my focus was on history and particularly on Europe, Russia, and the Middle East. So, of course, I had to learn about those financial markets. That's where you start digging into, what is the city of London? What are the mechanisms that pretty much hold Europe together? What is a central bank? You start asking these questions. And of course, as I'm sure you can assume, you start asking the wrong questions, people shut you down and they don't want to talk about it. Especially when you start asking, well, you have these central banks that oversee every single country in the world. Who owns these central banks? And that's where things get really, really shady because there's a whole lot of shell companies, there's a whole lot of private trusts, there's a whole lot of blind trusts, and there's a lot of corporate owners. So you start to piece together, in effect, who runs the global economy, who actually decides, what is going to happen with interest rates, or for example, what war is going to be started to seize resources in another country. A good example, especially with my early introduction in '03, was the Iraq War. In the United States, we were fed propaganda that said there were weapons of mass destruction. There was never
which was absolute BS.
Yeah, there was never any evidence presented, and it turned out all along the U.S. military industrial complex was after the oil because Iraq is one of the biggest oil producers in the Middle
Yep,
East.
and the gold too,
Yes, and going off the gold point, it only came out years after the fact that Saddam Hussein, I think it was back in 2001, there was this UN program called Oil for Food, which sounds like a scam because it is. And basically, they were selling oil for food supplies to the UN. Well, the UN, obviously, we know who runs them, and they wanted the oil more than they wanted to give food. So you had these, food riots, much like what happened in Syria, where, food prices start going up, and once bread prices start accelerating, that's when people typically go into the streets. And for the longest time, the media narrative was that Saddam Hussein was essentially siphoning off money from this UN oil for food program. And regardless of whether he was or not, the real purpose of the invasion was to prevent Saddam Hussein from selling oil to the European Union in euros and not US dollars. Because once you allow a single country to price oil in something other than dollars, that's the end of the monopoly. You can't enforce a monopoly if there are countries who are big time producers in OPEC basically refusing to follow your rules. And they did the same thing with Iran. When Iran or Persia's, former government dared to attempt to control its own oil and gas reserves, the CIA sent in their agents and they overthrew the government. And we got serious blowback. The 1979 Islamic Revolution that Iran
Yep.
never recovered
Hmm.
from. And it was all about oil. It had nothing to do with who was actually elected into the government. It was that the person who was chosen as prime minister dared to stand up to what was at the time, I believe, the Anglo-American Iranian petroleum companies. And it was all about seizing control over those resources because, right across the Persian Gulf, you have Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia, of course, is one of the biggest exporters of oil in the world. And they're also one of the U.S.'s biggest allies in the region. And it just so happens that Iraq borders Saudi Arabia. And it's no coincidence that Syria borders Iraq. And there's Iran. And there's Turkey. And you start to kind of see, especially if you look at how much oil
Jordan, Kuwait, and
and
Yemen and
you and you
Oman.
and you kind of see like, wait a minute, so all of these countries are huge oil producers and they're actually outproducing the United States. Well, to certain special interests in the United States, like the American Petroleum Institute, that was unacceptable. Hence why the US has invaded Iraq 3 times in the last 30 years, and why the US is currently occupying 30% of Syria's territory, because they do not want financial sovereignty to exist outside of their control, because once you allow one country to do it, other countries will follow, as we've seen with Russia, as we've seen with China, as we've even seen with India. Once a country gets an idea that they can produce their own resources, they can export their own resources, and they don't need US dollars to do it, that's the end of the global hegemony. And then you start having people ask questions like, why are we being forced to buy US dollars to purchase commodities? And it doesn't matter what commodity, it's every commodity on earth is priced in US dollars. And that kind of leads you down a very deep rabbit hole of, why is it that any country that decides to attempt to do this has a coup? Or even better, sanctions, as we see with Russia today. Why is it that the United States government is sanctioning Russia when Russia supplies Europe with fuel to heat their homes? They are purposefully crippling Europe to incite hyperinflation and fuel prices, which the
Hmm.
US will then gladly ship their overpriced liquid natural gas across the Atlantic at a premium on American tanker ships, which are also expensive to use, to countries like France and the UK and Germany and Italy too, to supply them with fuel. And if you look at the actual market dynamics, the United States cannot make up for Russia's loss of output. They just can't. They don't have the capacity. The United States is not a major shipbuilding nation anymore. They haven't been in a long time.
Oh no, definitely not. Especially when
And
all of the things are controlled by China, and
yeah,
stuff.
and
All the
and
manufacturing is
so
controlled by China.
in 20 and actually in late 2019, we started to see an increase in shipping costs. Traditionally, China has been the biggest source of cheap consumer products in the world. And part of that cheap cost was we had cheap fuel. And so as fuel prices started to accelerate, the cost of shipping anything from China started going up until eventually, and you can look at the charts, it went parabolic. And that pretty much halted the entire global shipping industry for 6-8 months, and we're only now starting to reap the consequences of that hyperinflation in fuel prices. So even though the United States is a major oil and gas producer, they will never be able to match Russia. And because Russia is so close to China, and they have something called the Power of Siberia pipeline that pumps fuel directly from Russia to China with no middlemen, that pipeline is a long-term supply deal. The United States cannot stop Russia from supplying China with fuel, just like the United States cannot stop China from purchasing Russian fuel directly through that pipeline. And it basically kind of creates this illusion that the United States runs the world when in fact, for the longest time, China has actually decided, what are the prices on the global marketplace, because if you want to buy something cheaply, you're not going to buy it from the United States. You're not going to buy it from Australia. You're not going to buy it from Canada. You're going to import it from China because traditionally that was what you did. And now we have seen the cost of shipping go through the roof, the cost of fuel go through the roof, and of course the cost to build new ships is absolutely insane. So nobody's doing it except for China. And the US, especially with liquid natural gas, you have to have specially outfitted ships to safely transport that fuel. And the cost, as well as the amount of time that is wasted shipping fuel across the Atlantic from the Gulf Coast, to the UK, that takes days, if not weeks. And you have people in the UK right now who need fuel to heat their homes, and they can't get it. And it's the
Nope, they
same
can't.
thing. It's the same thing playing out in France, in Germany, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and what's funny is for the longest time, the United Kingdom had some of the most valuable oil fields in the world. And the government
Oh yeah,
decided to
because in
uproot it.
Wales, in Wales, because in
Yeah.
Wales you have the big mining thing, and it was huge in Wales. There, as a Welshman, I know that.
Yeah. Well, and like for example, Norway being one of the largest oil producers in
Oh,
Europe,
absolutely.
you would think that Norway would be and the Norwegian oil companies would be more than happy to supply Europe, but they don't have the production capacity anymore to do that, and they've been lowering their output and exports for years on end. So this is all kind of cascading to a point where Operation Dark Winter is in progress as we speak, and it's going to be very dark for countries like Germany and the UK when they have to depend on imports from the United States that are going to be way more expensive than what they were paying Russia, and they don't have, domestic sources or local regional sources like they once did. And that's why there's been this concentrated effort to, especially with Syria and Iraq, to get pipelines built so that Saudi Arabia can ship oil directly to the Mediterranean, bypassing the Suez Canal, bypassing Egypt, eliminating all that extra cost because shipping anything to the Suez, you have to pay to use it. It's Egyptian territory. And the Saudis don't want to do that because they see that as a waste of capital. And there have been reports coming out recently that the Saudis have been having trouble with their oil wells. So they're pretty
Yeah, and they've been
just
having a bit of, a bit of a ruckus with Qatar at the moment. They have.
yes. Oh yeah, and Qatar unfortunately is, I think they're like the wealthiest per capita country in the Middle East, but they're essentially cut off from everyone by Saudi Arabia. And they're close allies with Iran. They do business with Pakistan. And last I checked, they were not in favor of Saudi Arabia invading Yemen. So there's a whole lot of stuff going on there. And they say that the Persian Gulf is one of the most dangerous places in the world to do business, but it's a choke point for the global oil industry. And without, controlling both sides of that Gulf, and especially like with Kuwait, there is no way to ensure security of your supply chain. So that's why they're pushing for oil pipelines through Iraq and Syria. And funny thing, Saddam Hussein refused, and Bashar Assad have refused. So it's not really a mystery as to why both countries were invaded and occupied by the United States because
And
they don't
Flynn,
they don't they don't want to play ball.
And let's not forget the big one, Libya, how Colonel Gaddafi wanted
Yes.
to create his own, standard. He wanted to get
Yes.
rid of the dollar. Because Libya at that time in the early 2020s had the highest standard of living in Africa. It was a very big growing economy, full of
Yep.
resources, full of luxury, free education, free healthcare.
Yes.
And he was against the elite. They dropped the
All
US dollar, and look what happened to them.
and the dirty secret is that it wasn't even necessarily the United States that was pushing so hard to depose him. It was the French and the Italians because they wanted the oil. Much like every other country, they wanted to control a foreign country's oil supply. And there's been this war going on in the Mediterranean for the last few years between Turkey and Greece and Cyprus, and of
That
course
could be the
Israel.
next big war that could kick off.
Yeah.
That I saw Turkey and Greece getting a bit angry, at each other. That could be the next proxy
Well,
war.
and the funny
Or,
thing is, like Greece has no military to speak of. Like
well,
they're they're
they're doomed. I don't know what to
they're
say about that. They're
they
doomed.
are they are not going to, like, if heaven forbid Turkey were to decide to declare war on Greece tomorrow, the entire European Union and NATO would be forced to make a decision because Turkey's a member of NATO. So
And
what happens,
something, Flynn?
yeah.
If that happened, do you really think that the NATO is going to be able to win, especially when they're getting their asses kicked by Russia and Ukraine?
No way, because NATO goes only as far as the United States says it does. And even though the US has been funneling absolutely ungodly amounts of money to Ukraine for the last, what, 7 months,
Yeah.
eventually it will end. And if the Republicans take back the House of Representatives in November, there are rumors that that's the end of funding to the Ukraine proxy war because the
Mhm.
Republicans don't want to spend the money on that. They would rather put their money towards the oil supply like Saudi Arabia, Syria, Iraq. They don't want to waste their time in Ukraine because they know that that's not a war they can win. Ultimately, Russia will do what it
Especially when
wants.
Russia's only using like 50% of their power. Well, they were,
Yeah.
but now they're pushing a little bit more power.
Well, and today it was just announced that 4 regions of Ukraine have voted to join Russia.
Yep,
So
the four eastern
eventually,
Ukrainian regions. So yeah,
eventually,
Russia's pretty
they're
much already won that war. Russia's not going
yeah.
to go after eastern Ukraine. I did hear that like Moldova and Poland might go after those regions, but yeah, it is what it is.
Well, I mean, like it's funny because before World War I, there was no such thing as a separate country called Ukraine. It was the Ukraine, a region of the Russian Empire, as it had been
Yep, that's
for
true.
hundreds of years. There was no Belarus, it was Russia. There was no Moldova, it was Russia. Russia was all of that. And
Mhm.
back then, at least, Ukraine was the breadbasket of Europe. They supplied everyone with food. So when World War I broke out, of course, you had all your entangling alliances, but after all the fighting had been finished, the victors of that war decided to carve up Eastern Europe. And they created this mess that we're facing right now, 100 years ago, by deciding arbitrary lines in the sand were borders. They didn't care who lived there. They did not care that the vast majority of eastern Ukraine was inhabited by ethnic Russians. They did not care that Belarus and Russia were one and the same. They are the same ethnic people. There is no fundamental difference in language. They share a common culture, common cultural identity, common history. What they did was they created this quagmire because they didn't want empires to be able to dictate to them what they could or couldn't do around the world. That's why the British Empire dominated for so long, because what did World War I result in? It resulted in the destruction of three empires: the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Austro Hungarian Empire. And look at where all these problems are today. The former Ottoman Empire, Russian Empire, and Austro Hungarian Empire, the former Yugoslavia. They created this mess so that they could essentially dictate to these smaller countries that were less unified,
Yeah,
ethnically
that's very
divided.
true.
It was created to cause problems so that they could then present their solution, which was, hey, we need to give every single, ethnic enclave its own territory, regardless of what government is in place, regardless of what their social policies are, regardless of what ethnic cleansing is going on. They just decided one day, yeah, that looks like a border. And lo and behold, we're seeing borders change right now. It does not matter what Kiev says. Kiev does not control eastern Ukraine. They have not since 2014. They can try,
Nope, because what happened in
but they're not going
2014
to.
was a
That
military coup done by the US government, which was terrible.
Yeah. Well, and the eastern regions said they are not going to observe that government as legitimate, and nobody cared. And for the last 8 years, the Ukrainian government in Kiev has been bombing the eastern regions
Hmm.
incessantly in direct violation of international law. You're not supposed to bomb civilian
And the
infrastructure.
Nuremberg rule,
Yes,
and
and
just to let you
yeah.
know, speaking about the Nuremberg Code, it's funny because all the presidents of the United States have been bombing, countries, not
Oh
all
yeah.
every president, but all those presidents of the bomb Middle Eastern countries, if the Nuremberg rules applied to the United States government, they would be hung for that. That's something that Nom,
Yes.
what's his name? What's his name? Not Nom, just the guy with the beard.
I'm sorry. Who? Oh, do you,
Oh,
do you
he's
mean
just
Noam Chomsky?
yeah. He said that. I
Yeah.
think it was him who said that.
Yeah. I,
Very
I
smart
I know
guy.
what you're referring to. Yeah. Well, and the funny thing is, like, the Nuremberg trials were a show trial because Germany was not the only country that committed horrendous acts against people. The Poles
Oh,
did, the Ukrainians did, the Soviets did, the French, the British, the Americans, everyone committed horrendous crimes against humanity. And only
oh
the
yeah, the
humans were ever
United
held.
States
Yeah.
bombing Japan. The Japanese have their horrible things.
Well, and
Yeah.
like nobody wants to consider the reality that the U.S. ultimately was the biggest destroyer of European culture in both world wars because if the U.S. had not firebombed Dresden, Dresden would still be home to buildings that were hundreds of years old that had stood for
Where's
since the Middle
Dresden? Where's
Ages.
that?
Dresden it was one of the cultural capitals of Germany before the war. So like your Middle Ages era buildings were in Dresden. Like Berlin obviously is more of like a federal capital, but Dresden was traditionally more of the cultural center. And the same thing actually happened in Japan when it came time to the decision making behind dropping the atomic bomb, because there were some people in the US military who were saying, you need to bomb all of these shrines because you need to put the Japanese down. And then you had other people who said, no, 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 you're going to create generational resentment that will not end well. Because, if you look at World
And you
War
know what?
One, it was no discovery.
The Japanese were already retreating. They had
Yes.
already lost the war, and the reason why the United States pretty much dropped that bomb was because of the elitists. It was because of the bankers.
Yeah, well, and
That
and you know what's more profitable than war?
death is pretty much death.
Well, rebuilding after a war destroys all the infrastructure.
Yep, that's a good point. That is a very
That's
good point.
like if you look at Japan, the United States wiped out hundreds of thousands of people. No one batted an eyelash. But when it came time to rebuilding, the United States Congress went out of its way, bent over backwards, provided billions and billions of dollars to the Japanese government that it just subjected to its, military rule to rebuild. And lo and behold, the United States built Japan into one of the most powerful economies the world had ever seen. They produced consumer electronics for generations. And if you look at Ukraine right now, the same exact thing is happening. You have these corporate interests who are circling, waiting for some kind of peace treaty to be signed so that they
Which is
can
not going to happen, pretty
exactly
much.
so that they can swoop in and say, "Oh, this part of Ukraine, we would like to, take over all the farmland and build factory farms." Monsanto is one of the biggest, players there, and it's no different with like the electrical transmission lines, oil pipelines. You can kind of see like where it leads to because ultimately at the end of the day, if you bomb a country into submission, ultimately you need to rebuild it. Well, rebuilding is an incredibly lucrative business because it's got to be done by somebody. So why not American companies that are waiting with their money in hands to throw at the government of, whatever country they just destroyed? They did the same thing in Iraq. After mercilessly bombing Iraq, destroying all the infrastructure, in Fallujah, all around Baghdad.
Yeah, when you look at the
It's just
photos of like what
insane.
Yemen and like Iraq and Iran were like, they seem like beautiful places,
Yes,
like
that's
absolutely beautiful
so.
places,
Yeah.
wonderful. And Afghanistan used to be a Buddhist country. Same
Yes.
thing of Lebanon. Lebanon used to be so beautiful. It was a Christian nation, and obviously the United States government and the British government pretty much funded,
Yeah.
the Islamic extremists to overtake it, pretty much.
Well, and not just that, but that was like that region was the so-called cradle of civilization, where we get much of our historical
Mesopotamia.
cult,
Yep.
like especially you have your Sumerians, your Babylonians, your Assyrians, your Persians, your Ottomans, your Turks. Like that was the center of the world for a very long time. And if you look at it today, none of those countries can stand on their own in the global marketplace and compete with anyone because Iran is heavily sanctioned. There's a trade embargo from the United States. Iraq is essentially reduced to an oil exporter. Syria, for as far as we know now, 30% of the territory is occupied by the United States military. So the Syrian government does not even make money from 30% of the territory they are supposed to oversee. And, if you look at Saudi Arabia, the vast majority of the country is the desert. It is not usable land. Regardless of what, Mohammed bin Salman wants to claim he's going to do, they are not going
Is
to
that is that
magically
his
turn that.
name?
Yeah, huh?
Is that his name?
Yeah, his name is Mohammed bin Salman.
Oh, sorry. I thought it sounded like I thought you said Bin Laden for a second
No,
at the
no,
end of
no. That
that.
that's that's just the largest construction conglomerate in Saudi Arabia that you mixed up there.
Hmm.
But I mean, at the same time, you look at how Saudi Arabia functions, they depend almost entirely on oil exports. So now they're desperately trying to diversify their economy and say, hey, Western money, come invest in us. We're going to have sports arenas and we're going to have live music, even though it's banned. Or we're going to have beaches where you have to cover up. It's like everything they try to do, it's so blatantly transparent because it's just a money grab at the end of the day. The
Hmm.
whole
That's
the
true.
whole green movement is predicated predominantly on solar and wind power. But in order to produce solar panels, you need silver. In order to produce wind turbines, it takes a long time to build them. And once they're built, they have a shelf life, so to speak. And as we found out in Texas, if you do not winterize your wind turbines, they don't work in the wintertime. And lo and behold, that exact thing has happened all over the world with solar and wind. And the more you kind of dive into it, you can kind of see through the agenda, which is destroy oil and gas dominant countries that aren't the United States,
Exactly, bro. That's what it
and
is. What it
and
is.
push solar, which by the way, a huge chunk of the solar power industry is dominated by China. They produce the majority of the world's solar panels. They produce them the most cheaply. So even though Canada and the United States might be producing them, they do not compete with the Chinese. They are predominantly selling within their own country. Like there's been this big push in California where I think every new house now that is built in the state of California must have some sort of rooftop solar, which has just led to an increasingly higher price for the cost of buying a new house and of building a new house in California, to the point where you have long-time natives living in California for generations who are being priced out of the housing market because the government decided, hey, here's another mandate you have to follow, and if you don't, you're not allowed to build. And they wonder, like, going back to the whole how do you fix the housing market in the United States, stop dictating to builders what they have to do, because all they're doing is increasing the price of the materials and the cost of building. And as labor costs go up, all that's going to do is just snowball to the point where, like 20 years ago, the cost of a new house averaged, around $200,000. Now it's over 380, close to 400,000. And it's not as if they're building the houses any better. It's just that the parts and the costs of manufacturing are so much higher that the home
That's true.
builders and the other big thing, and I don't know necessarily as much about Canada and Australia and the UK, but in the United States, you have a select group of very powerful home building companies that have bought up all the smaller competitors to the point where if you want to buy a new house, unless you have enough money to do a custom build with your own, personally sought out labor team and architect, you're going to have to buy a house from one of these mass producers. And the mass producers will always cut corners. They will always build as cheaply as they can to maximize their profit margins. And typically, it's not really a great product. They're building super overpriced houses that aren't even worth half as much of what they're selling for. And those mortgages that are now averaging over 7%, what happens when the housing market collapses? Everyone's going to be
Oh, shit's going to
underwater.
hit the fan. It's
Yeah,
going to get very ugly, mate.
and you know what happens then? The banks come and foreclose on all those houses, take them just like they did in '08, and rinse and repeat. Every 10 to 14 years, the housing market goes through a cycle where either the mortgage rates are too high and people just stop buying, or you have, a global economic collapse, which basically says, yeah, no one's buying houses right now. People are selling everything they can for cash. And so,
Hmm.
like, looking at those home builders, they are essentially dictating market prices, which it operates as a cartel, really, at the end of the day. And that's not how you build what they call sustainable housing. That's not how you build long-term solutions to, nationwide homelessness. You
No
have
worries.
to
That's
you
fair enough.
have to come and meet the people halfway. If the average young person under 40 can't afford to buy a house right now, they're not going to be able to afford to buy a house when they're 60.
Oh, tell me about it, dude. That's one thing that's a huge problem. So, Flynn,
Yeah.
before we finish off the show
Yeah, yeah.
today, because it's been an hour, it's been a real cool having you. You've done a very good job explaining economics, and you're very smart when it comes to this, which is awesome.
Thanks.
I was I was just wondering before we finish off. Okay, two things I want to ask you
Yeah.
is first, what advice would you give to people who, especially when if the economy does collapse and everything does go to shit? And two, where can people find you?
Okay, so to answer that first one, I'll try and make this as concise as possible. So, depending on what country you live in, it's going to be different, obviously, for different countries. But if the vast majority of your so called wealth is in a bank account, my personal take is do not trust the banks to safeguard your money, because at the end of the day, you can have a repeat of Cyprus where the banks take your money and give you worthless bank stock instead, which then goes down in value because the bank stock can be shorted. So I would definitely say take control over your actual money. So what that usually translates to in the traditional sense relates to physical gold and silver, which is in short supply right now because people have been panic buying for the last 3 years. Now, other than that, I would say typically, have some sort of water filtration system at home, because when the power goes out, so does the water. And that's a big problem that most people are not talking about because they take the water for granted. They think that, oh, when I turn my sink on, there's going to be water and I can drink from it. Well, you have no guarantee that water is safe to drink. And when the power goes out, you have no guarantee the water will run. So having, if you own property, having like an actual well that you can, control and filter yourself, or just having like a tabletop water filter will help dramatically, especially because you can survive, for several days without food, but you cannot survive very long without water. And there are already water wars going on right now all around the world, and there's still plenty of time to take care of this. But then, other than that, I would say having some sort of stockpiled non-perishable foods, canned foods, particularly your basic staples, beans, rice, pasta, oatmeal is a great one as well. Your very basic foods that are generally very cheap to obtain, but also have a longer shelf life. But yeah, and as for where you can find me, I do have a website. It is mercadomaestro.com. There is currently a video posted to it. I made it a couple months ago about BlackRock. It is quite a trip. Um, but I also do have a YouTube channel that I'm working on getting up and running fully. It does have some of my videos with technical analysis, looking at some different cryptocurrencies. But I can provide the link to that. Unfortunately, I do not have enough followers yet to get my custom URL, but I will definitely provide the link to that to you to post along with this.
No worries. Anyways, thank you for coming on my show, Flynn. It was a pleasure having you. It was really cool. I was very honored to have your first interview of you, which was cool.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to coming back because I think that we have a lot in common, and we both kind of come from similar schools of thought, and especially there's a lot more that we can discuss later.
Exactly. Thank you for coming on my show, Flynn. And I just want to say to everybody, thank you for joining the Watch Republic podcast, episode 64. Have a nice day, everybody.